Officer Todd Reynolds had been patrolling the quiet streets of Oakridge for over a decade. A self-proclaimed law and order man, he prided himself on keeping the town in check, especially when it came to people who, in his eyes, didn't belong. Tonight, as he sat in his cruiser sipping coffee, his gaze locked onto a sleek black SUV rolling to a stop at a red light. The driver, a black woman, was talking on her phone. His lips curled into a smirk. "Illegal phone use while driving," he muttered, flicking on his siren. The SUV pulled over calmly. As Todd approached, he noticed the woman's belly. She was visibly pregnant. "License and registration," he barked before she could speak. The woman, calm and composed, handed over her documents. "Officer, I don't believe I was breaking any laws." Todd barely glanced at the papers before launching into a speech. "You people think you can do whatever you want. Maybe where you came from, this is acceptable, but not in Oakridge." The woman's brow furrowed. "Excuse me. I saw you on the phone," Todd snapped. "I was on Bluetooth," she corrected. "I wasn't touching my phone." Todd didn't like being challenged. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "I don't see why that's necessary," she replied firmly. His temper flared. "Step." "Oh, no." With a sigh, she unbuckled her seatbelt and carefully stepped onto the pavement. As she moved, Todd suddenly grabbed her wrist. "Hey!" she protested, jerking away. That was all he needed. Resisting arrest. Todd growled, twisting her arm. She gasped, pain flashing across her face. "Let me go." Before she could finish, another car pulled up. The door flew open, and a sharply dressed man hurried over. "Officer, unhand her immediately." Todd barely glanced at him. "Step back, sir. This is police business." The man shook his head. "That's Governor Naomi Carter." Todd froze. His eyes darted to the documents in his hand. Naomi Carter, the first black female governor of the state. His blood ran cold. The governor pulled herself free, straightening her coat despite the pain in her wrist. "Officer Reynolds, you're going to regret this." Todd stumbled back. I didn't realize." "Exactly," she said coldly. "You saw a black woman and assumed she was a criminal. And now you'll answer for it." 2 state troopers arrived within minutes. Todd didn't even have time to explain before he was placed in cuffs. As they loaded him into the back of a squad car, Naomi Carter stepped forward, staring at him through the window. "You thought your badge made you powerful," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Turns out, mine is bigger." The door shut. And just like that, the racist cop met justice. Officer Todd Reynolds sat in a cold interrogation room, his hands cuffed in front of him. His mind raced. How had everything gone so wrong so fast? 1 minute, he was doing his job, his way. The next, he was sitting under bright fluorescent lights, waiting to see what his future held. The door opened. In walked Governor Naomi Carter, looking just as composed as she had on the street. Behind her, a man in a crisp suit, her attorney. Todd sat up straight. "Governor Carter," he started, forcing a smile. "Look, I think this is all just a mistake," she finished for him. Her voice was even, but her eyes burned. "That's exactly what people like you always say." Todd swallowed. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "Let me tell you what's going to happen next." Todd's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "You're being charged with misconduct, excessive force, and unlawful detainment. The Oakridge Police Department is launching an investigation, and trust me, I'll be overseeing it personally." Todd's mouth went dry. "You can't do that." She raised an eyebrow. "I can. And I will." Her attorney slid a folder onto the table. "Officer Reynolds, you have a history of targeting black citizens in traffic stops. Over 50 complaints have been filed against you in the past 5 years, most dismissed without investigation." Todd's fingers twitched. "I was doing my job." Naomi scoffed. "Your job has put this town at risk. I ran on a promise to clean up corruption in law enforcement. Looks like you're the perfect place to start." The door opened again. This time, Chief Daniels, his boss, stepped in. His face was grim. "Reynolds," the chief said, shaking his head. You're done. Todd blinked. What? You're being fired, effective immediately, the chief continued. And based on what the DA decides, you might be seeing jail time. Todd's heart pounded. He had expected a slap on the wrist, maybe a suspension, not this. Naomi stood up. I hope you understand something, Officer Reynolds. The old way of doing things is over. You thought you had power? You abused it. Now you'll answer for it. She turned toward the door but paused. And by the way, that pregnant black woman you attacked? She's the reason you'll never wear a badge again. As she walked out, Todd slumped in his chair. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. And he hated it. The courtroom buzzed with tension as people filled the seats. Reporters lined the walls, cameras flashing, notebooks scribbling. This wasn't just any trial, this was justice in motion. At the defendant's table, Todd Reynolds sat stiffly, wearing a navy suit that did nothing to hide his discomfort. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but Todd barely heard him. His eyes flickered to the prosecution's table. There she was, Governor Naomi Carter. Though she wasn't the prosecutor, she sat in the front row, watching him. The judge entered, banging the gavel. Court is now in session. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed black woman named Jacqueline Monroe, stood. Your Honor, the people bring forth evidence that Officer Todd Reynolds engaged in a pattern of racial profiling, excessive force, and abuse of power, culminating in his unlawful arrest of Governor Naomi Carter. Murmurs rippled through the room. Todd's attorney stood, clearing his throat. Your Honor, my client was simply performing his duty. The governor was uncooperative, and my client. Uncooperative? Jacqueline interrupted. He threw a pregnant woman against a car because she dared to ask questions. The judge nodded. Proceed. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Oncoming police car, a young black man testified that Todd had pulled him over last year and threatened to arrest him for looking suspicious. Oncoming police car, a Latina mother recounted how Todd had harassed her husband, demanding proof of citizenship. Oncoming police car, a retired police captain admitted under oath that complaints against Todd had been ignored for years. Each testimony chipped away at Todd's defense. Then came the final witness. Naomi Carter took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she adjusted the microphone. Governor Carter, Jacqueline began, please describe what happened that night. Naomi's voice was steady, but her eyes burned with fire. I was driving home when Officer Reynolds stopped me. I was polite. I complied. And yet, because of my race, he decided I was a threat. She turned toward Todd, locking eyes with him. I want this court to understand, I wasn't stopped for a crime. I was stopped because Officer Reynolds saw my black skin and decided that was enough. The jury was motionless, hanging on to every word. Jacqueline leaned forward. And what happened after? Naomi inhaled. He yanked my arm, twisted it behind my back. I told him I was pregnant. He didn't care. She shook her head. He only stopped when another officer arrived, someone who recognized me. Jacqueline let the words settle before speaking again. What would have happened if you weren't the governor? Naomi turned to the jury. I could have been arrested, beaten, or worse. Silence. Even Todd could feel it. He had already lost. Small blue diamond, the verdict. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The judge read the decision. Guilty on all counts. Todd's face drained of color. His lawyer sat motionless. The judge's voice rang out, Officer Reynolds, you abused your power. I hereby sentence you to 5 years in prison and a lifetime ban from law enforcement. Gasps and cheers erupted. Naomi exhaled. Justice had been served. As Todd was led away in cuffs, he turned back, looking at Naomi one last time. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply watched. Because she knew, this wasn't just about her. It was about all the people he had wronged. And justice had finally arrived.